Good afternoon. My name is Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Policy, and I get the honor of moderating this panel, Thawing Ice, Rising Tensions, New Geopolitics, and Security Threats in the Arctic. Well, as made clear in the last panel, and I'd also point out last week at the Atlantic Council Conference on this realm, thawing ice and new technology has made thousands of square miles increasingly accessible in the Arctic. Accessible to the Arctic nations, to non-Arctic nations, non-state actors, including businesses and other organizations. This new space and its vast natural resources, its oil reserves, its gas reserves, its rich fishing territories, its minerals, and the impact that the environment up there, the changing environment up there, has on the globe as a whole, makes this a realm that's a pretty good catalyst for international collaboration. And we got a big dose of that yesterday or last week, and actually this afternoon went from Amy Pope, about all the great things that the Arctic Council has been driving forward, what President Obama and his team has been driving forward. I'm biased. My brother is part of that team. But at the same time, we have to recognize that rich resources, rapid change, opening space can also be a real recipe for geopolitical confrontation and collision. Look at some of the catalysts that are out there. Territorial claims by Norway, Russia, Canada, Denmark, United States. Differences over how to define or treat important seaways, be it the national or international seaways. Seaways that, if they become more accessible, could dramatically change the flow of global commerce. Think about the new actors that are up there. China, India, Japan, interestingly also Poland, Singapore. And then looming south of the Arctic, I was going to say looming under the Arctic, but that's a different connotation. Looming south of the Arctic is growing tension between Russia and the West. Now, clearly, the Arctic is in a realm where there is lots of cooperation going on. One of the few areas of constructive engagement between the West, between the United States and Russia. But the Arctic is also the self realm, or the safe realm, for Russian ballistic missile submarines. It's a positioning point for Russia potentially in a major conflict with the West to shut off our Atlantic sea lines of communication. Look at the militarization of the region, the new bases, the old bases that are being reanimated up there. And I've just read in today's paper that the Deputy Minister of Defense, Dmitry Bulgakov, stated today, the infrastructure preparedness on all the Arctic islands has already allowed units there to assume combat duty. That's the attitude the Russians are bringing, or Putin is bringing, to the Arctic. There are also upcoming decisions. In the coming years, perhaps the next 3 to 5 years, the UN Commission on the limits of the continental shelf will be making decisions on the different territorial claims in that region. There will be some winners, there will be some losers, and between now and then there may be efforts to preordain or shape those decisions. So our panel today is going to assess the geopolitical currents defining the Arctic today and tomorrow, how they're going to affect our U.S. interests, and what near and long-term actions the United States government should take to protect and promote those interests. As Amy Pope put at the end of her statement, to protect the peace. And they'll be asked also, to what role should international organizations play in this changing environment, be it the Arctic Council or other organizations, perhaps NATO. So we have a great panel with us. We have Dr. Janine Davidson, right next to me, the Undersecretary of the Navy. She's de facto the number 2. She runs everything that the Secretary does, management, budgets, policy, perhaps the toughest, the integration of the Marines and the Navy.
Piece of cake.
2 great organizations. She brings a lot of experience to this job, which she's had now for 6 months. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy and Plans. It's a big force posture responsibility. She served as the Director of Stability Operations. And really relevant to this conversation, she served as a senior advisor to SAC-EUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. In the center, we have General Joe Ralston from the Air Force. He spent 37 years in the Air Force. I think his last position when I first got to know him, when he was SAC-UR and commander of EUCOM. He also served as commander of Alaskan Command. In his military career, he's had combat missions, counterterrorism missions, humanitarian missions in the Balkans, the Mediterranean, Africa, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's a storied career. But what really makes him an expert in our subject today is that he lives outside of Anchorage. Admiral James Loy, Jim Loy, Coast Guard, former Secretary or Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, served for 2 years in 2003, 3 years, 2003 to 5, as a Deputy U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security. He served as the administrator of the Transportation Security Administration. He was Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. And sometimes I make the mistake of, when I think about the Coast Guard, I think about keeping our seaways safe, our waters clean, fighting drugs and thugs. We often forget they're also ready to stand for combat duty. And he, in fact, did that as Coast Guard officer in Vietnam. And so we thank you for that. So I'm going to turn to our speakers. We're going to give them each a moment to kind of share their perspectives on this. And then we'll have a moderated discussion. Janine.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, everybody, for coming and sticking it out to, this is the last panel, right?
Almost.
Almost, OK.
Second to last.
Well, as Ian said, I'm the Undersecretary of the Navy, and so I'd like to provide a bit of an operational perspective and give you sort of a sense of how the military is thinking about its role as the region changes, and in particular, the Navy. Obviously, the Arctic region is largely a maritime environment. There's a lot of water up there. It's not very navigable yet. But the melting sea ice in the Arctic is definitely going to have some security implications because, as we know, conflict happens where the people are. And when more people are there, we can probably expect conflict. But conflict doesn't always mean war. It can mean debate over resources and such like that. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. And I know that Amy did as well. I'd like to sort of emphasize at the get-go that we in the Pentagon and in the Navy still see the Arctic as a low-threat environment compared to things that are going on in the rest of the world, and we have global responsibilities. That doesn't mean that we're not, keeping an eye on things, and that we're not thinking about how things are going to be changing over time there. But as Ian said, nations, including Russia, have demonstrated a desire to cooperate over issues in the Arctic and to resolve their disputes peacefully so far. So I'm sure, as Amy discussed this morning or earlier today, the U.S. end state, as we call it, or our objectives, are for a secure and stable region where U.S. national interests are safeguarded, the U.S. homeland is defended, and nations work cooperatively to address challenges. We also want to focus on the environment, and people will be looking to extract and leverage the resources that are there, and we want that to happen in a sustainable way and in a way that helps protect the environment. And as I'll talk about a little bit, the Navy has a lot of experience in thinking about the environment and helping people protect it. So the military's part of this overall government strategy is to focus on the security parts of this, to support safety, to promote defense cooperation, and to be prepared to respond in case there are challenges, disasters, contingencies, to operate with our partners and allies, but also to be prepared to do so solo if we need to. Being prepared for conflict or challenges is also what you have to do in order to deter, as Ian and I have discussed in many other forums. So the Navy's missions in support of these interests include the things that they include just about everywhere else: freedom navigation, defense support to civil authorities, including the U.S. Coast Guard, search and rescue operations. So basically, the Navy's task is to simply do what the Navy does everywhere else: promote freedom of navigation, safety, stability, prevent conflict, and to do it all with partners while respecting the environment. Except it's not that simple, because this is the Arctic, and the Arctic is not a normal place. We must do all this sort of normal stuff on the ice, under the ice, over the ice, in very harsh conditions. So let me sort of drop anchor a little bit and talk about what that looks like. That's what they say in the Navy. It's a unique, harsh, and pretty delicate environment. It kind of stinks up there to operate. Alaska's a nice place to live, but you're not all the way up. actually begins to form on the submarines if they stay up there too long before they go back down. I mean, it's like within not that much time. There was a 60 Minutes episode about ice X, which I'll talk about, and you can actually see that sort of on the submarine. It's also hard just to get to the Arctic and to get around in the Arctic. Harsh weather conditions affect the communications. We have things like ionic disturbances and geomagnetic storms. There's limited satellite coverage in that part of the world, 65 degrees above. And terrestrial communication apparatus are limited, so it's hard to communicate. It's hard to navigate. You don't have the navigation aids up there like you do down here. I remember even in one of my last flights when I was in the Air Force in the C-17, we flew up to Greenland, which isn't even as far as what we're talking about now. And back then we didn't have GPS on our airplanes, and so we had to do what people are going to have to start doing again, is like focus on using inertial navigation and dead reckoning. And we were kind of like, what's going to happen? Because we had never been up that far before. So as we continue to venture forward and get that experience, that's part of learning how to operate in this environment. But it's not easy. It's hard to get around. It's also exacerbated, especially for the Navy, by the fact that it's not mapped very well. Okay, I mean, you can't map ice, and it moves all around anyway. But under the ice, we haven't done the exploration there yet. So that's all starting to happen as well. And there's a lot of stuff under the water that you can bump into, it turns out. I'm learning this in the Navy. Any submariners in here? No? Yeah? So, right? Am I right? Stuff under there. Right. Not charted very well. Not necessarily a very safe environment. So all this means it's hard to get there. It's hard to operate. It's far away. So one of our primary missions that we think about for the Navy, and it's mostly a Coast Guard mission, but we expect to be in support, is humanitarian relief, disaster assistance. So, as the ice starts to melt and as more people want to go up there, you have merchant ships or cruise ships, the chances for people to get in trouble and to need help is definitely going to increase. And so we're thinking about that. And how do you operate? Well, it's hard to get there. If there's a disaster, you need to get there quickly, which means you need to be positioned forward. But that's hard to do because how do you can't build up there very easily. It's not very, you can't build very many months out of the year, and you can't build on the ice. The ice moves, ice melts. So that's hard to do as well. So ice camps are kind of sketchy also, as we see with ice X. The ice can crack right underneath your camp, right, when you're not even expecting it. So all this means that the Navy will need to adapt in order to operate in this changing environment. It is changing. People will be going there, and the Navy will be part of that. We, the Navy, will need to improve our operational capabilities, our expertise, our capacity, our ability to extend our reach into that region in order to promote new kinds of competencies. Interoperability of a different kind with our interagency partners, including the Coast Guard, and our international partners. We're going to need to do better with our communications technologies, with our satellite coverage and our navigational aids. These are kinds of investments that are going to need to be made. Not all of them are military or Navy, but we'll definitely need to be cooperating for that. And just basic things like cold weather gear and equipment, charts and maps and things that the military needs to be thinking about as we operate there more. We'll continue to train and exercise with our allies and partners, doing everything we do everywhere else, only in a worse environment. We have all kinds of exercises already that we've been doing, and we're doing more of them. Some of them with our European partners, like ball tops, require some of these capabilities and skill sets. But then sometimes we'll just go up to the Arctic and practice, like ice X, which is a really cool thing that we do. The Navy has an Arctic roadmap. It just got republished in 2014. It emphasizes, this is great Pentagon language, low-cost, long-lead activities that position the Navy to meet future demands through informed, focused, and deliberate investments to match capability and capacity to future demands, safeguarding enduring national interests. This is the kind of language they use in the Pentagon all the time. So what the heck does this mean? So it means from an investment standpoint that we will make adjustments over time, and that we'll do it with our normal processes, which actually are not so bad philosophically. Meaning, who do we need to task to be thinking about how to operate more competently in the Arctic? So we have EUCOM, where the good general used to lead, and NORTHCOM, and also we have things like the Arctic Submarine Laboratory. All of these folks, so the EUCOM and NORTHCOM will be thinking about what sorts of contingencies they need to be prepared for, and the Arctic Submarine Laboratory was thinking about like how do you operate more cleverly in the Arctic. The submarine laboratory is actually kind of cool. It's in San Diego, go figure, it's warm down there. It's not actually new. It started in 1969. You know, the Navy did its first ice dive in 1947. In 1958, it did its first transpolar crossing, and it was its first use of inertial navigation up there. And in 1959 was when it did its first submarine break through the ice. So we've been doing this for a long time. But it is changing, and I think it will become a more challenging environment as more people start to go up there. So today's Navy provides capability and presence primarily, actually, through its undersea capability. So the focus for now is on submarines. But as the ice starts to break more in the years to come, we'll be thinking about what that means for our surface fleet as well. So the key for now, what we're really focusing on is learning, increasing our expertise, training, exercise, support, also important, support to scientific research and discovery. So we partner with scientists to promote some of these cooperative behavior. A cool example of all of this is ISEX, which we just had in March. The week I started my job, in March, my boss, Secretary Mabus, was under the ice for 5 days on a submarine at ISEX. I'm like, hey, where's Secretary Mabus? Well, he won't be back. He's like literally under the ice and not able to communicate, right? 60 Minutes was up there with him, so when he popped out of the ice, they were there. So you can go online and watch that 60 Minutes episode and watch him pop out of the submarine as it comes out of the ice. But ISEX is a pretty cool thing because it's designed to mostly test our capabilities and our readiness for the submarine fleets. But we also go up there with scientists, and we have unmanned vehicles that we put into the subsurface to map some of the ocean floor so we can get more navigational information and geography information, weather information. So it's a great opportunity to just keep learning. And that's run by the Sub Lab out of San Diego. The other thing that people have sort of less knowledge about in the Navy is that, well, we do a lot of focus on our energy and on the environment. And one of the last things I was going to mention is the focus on making sure that as we move into the Arctic, we do so in a clean way. Because you know, right now we use a lot of diesel up in that part of the world, but in this last ISEX, we experimented with a lot more wind energy, clean wind energy, and so I think that is another area where you're going to see the military, the Navy in particular, trying to operate a lot more. So, in sum, the Navy's going to keep doing what the Navy does everywhere in the world, or only they're going to do it in the Arctic, and it's going to be harder.
Thank you, Janine. That's a pretty powerful statement about how the Navy is beginning to grapple with some of the changes that are coming its way, driven by the receding ice cap. Thank you. Sure. Joe?
Ian, thank you very much. And I'm asking my colleagues to make a handout here that I'll talk to in just a minute. But while they're doing that, I'd like to go back and correct the record from the first panel that we listened to today. I'd let it be known that I have never, ever yelled at Admiral Larson. He was such a competent and likable officer. How could that possibly be true? But Don, good to be with you here again today. I want to give you some reasons for why. Secretary Davidson has talked about the Navy, and so let me talk to you a little bit about Air and Army forces for a moment. But I want to give you a reason for why we need military forces in Alaska. I want to give you two reasons for that, and then I want to tie that to the economic opportunities as well. First of all, if you look at your map, most of the time you see a Mercator projection, and it always has Alaska and the Arctic up in the left-hand corner. What you've got in front of you is a polar projection, which I contend is a more accurate look at the globe. And the point I want to make there is, for our forces that we have in Alaska, that's the most, as Billy Mitchell said to the Congress in 1935, the most strategic location on Earth for aviation. Because in 8.5 hours, by air, I can be within 90% of the industrialized world from Alaska. I could never get the Pentagon to understand, when I was commander of Alaskan Command, that my F-15s in Anchorage could be in the Balkans quicker than the same airplane on the east coast of the United States. And those airplanes can be in Korea in 6 hours. So if you have a small number of forces, you're much better off to put it in Alaska, where they can go east, they can go west, wherever they're needed. FedEx and UPS understand this more than the Pentagon. Both have major hubs in Anchorage, Alaska, because they can be anywhere in 8.5 hours in the Northern Hemisphere. The Air Force sort of gets it. It's taken a while for us to do it. The Air Force has 3 wings of F-22s, the premier fighter that we've got. One of those 3 wings is in Anchorage. The Air Force has 3 bases for their AWACS airplanes, their radar control airplanes that we need in every combat operation. One of those 3 bases is Anchorage, Alaska. The Air Force has made the decision to put a wing of their newest fighter, the F-35, when it comes on board, in Fairbanks for the same reason. It's got wonderful training opportunities and can go east or west. C-17s, only a handful of bases with C-17s, but one of them happens to be Elmendorf in Anchorage, Alaska. We've got tankers there. We've got C-130s there, all for the reason that they can go wherever needed on short notice. So from a power projection point of view, those are why you want to have forces in the Arctic. Let me go to the second reason. And this is something that Amy Pope talked about. We all want a peaceful and stable Arctic. But if you go back over the centuries, one of the most unstable things you can do is have a high number of forces on this side and a low number of forces on this side. And when you have the Russians talking about where we're going to put 4 more brigades into the Arctic, we're going to put a division in Chukotka. We've got 41 icebreakers, and we've just fielded our nuclear icebreaker. Now, I'm not criticizing the Russians for doing that. I applaud them for doing that. They're using vision, strategic vision. Some of the things they're doing are not stable. For example, Iskander missiles, nuclear missiles, into Kaliningrad that threaten Arctic nations. Now, when you talk about a threat, and I'm not trying to build Russia as a threat here, but you have to look at 2 things, capability and intent. Capability is pretty easy to look at. You can count the number of brigades and the number of 16 air bases they're going to upgrade and the Iskander missiles. Intent, I'm not about to try to predict what the intent is, but intent can change overnight. And so you have to have the matching capability in order to have stability in the Arctic. While the Russians were putting 4 new brigades, the U.S. only has 2 brigades in the Arctic. And because of budget pressures, the administration made a decision 2 years ago to take half of those out of the Arctic. When that got to our congressional delegation, quite frankly, did a good job, spearheaded by Senator Sullivan on the Senate Armed Services Committee. When he started asking questions to Secretary Carter and to the new Army chief, does this make a lot of sense? While the Russians are putting more, that we're taking it out, and they were doing it for budgetary reasons. They said, you know, on second thought, that's not a good idea. We're going to leave that brigade there. But the budget pressures are always going to be there to do it, which brings me to my third point. Tom Barrett talked about the pipeline. When I was commander of Alaskan Command, we were shipping 2, and if it goes much lower than that, it's going to shut down because you can't keep oil flowing at low temperatures at very low volume. We've got to put more oil into that pipeline. If that pipeline shuts down, the Alaska economy is going to really be in trouble. And all the Costco's, the Sam's Clubs, the Walmarts that are there today to keep the cost of living for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines under control, it's going to get very, very expensive. And the cost of living, the COLA allowance is going to have to be there. It's going to be more budget pressures. So we've got to have the economic investment in the infrastructure, back to the leasing in the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea. We need to keep those options alive. So that's the end of my thing. I'll come back later on.
Thank you, Joe. That's an important reminder about geography and proximity that we often underappreciate about the Arctic. Your map, I think, is pretty graphic.
That's great.
About how it points out, how quickly one can get to Europe vice the East Coast, and then, of course, its proximity to important points in Asia.
Right.
Jim?
Ian, thank you, and thanks to the council for putting this on. I think these kind of conversations and discussions with regard to what's clearly going to be probably for the next 10 to 20 years at least, one of the most talked about corners of the world, and those corners of the world, or one of those corners of the world with extraordinary U.S. interests. I'd like to start to talk, or just to mention a context here, and if you think of it in a historical fashion, at the end of World War II, when the Undersecretary's Navy gave all those icebreakers to the Coast Guard to deal with over the next 10 or 12 or 15 years, the context about Alaska, about the Arctic, was only about two things. It was about access, and it was about science. What is it that was going on in the Arctic that made good sense for the U.S. interests with regard to the science that we could learn from the area, from the region, and what kind of issues were there attended to access in the event that we found a reason to get to the Arctic? Could we, in fact, do that in the greater interest of U.S. security, core U.S. interests, national security interests? So, as the Undersecretary has mentioned, the same sense is in 2016 as it was in 1945. We're very much interested in the Arctic with regard to access and with regard to science. Science now has morphed its way towards the discussion the first panel was all about with regard to energy challenges, with regard to climate control and all such things. I can go back to that in just a moment. But with regard to access, I don't think the real issues have changed very much. The capability to do it well may be a question that is clearly on the table given the notion with regard to 40 Russian icebreakers as opposed to 2 heavy breakers in the U.S., one of which truly has become a parts bin for the other one because it's 60 years old. And then, of course, the Coast Guard Cutter Healy, which is our scientific icebreaker, which addresses primarily the second notion of science as opposed to access. So the core U.S. interest in the maritime world of sea and air deployment for strategic lift and deterrence, or whatever might be our responsibilities to deal with that. The notion of maritime presence in what is clearly emerging as the third ocean, if you will, with regard to what surrounds our country, and dealing with that as constructively as she suggested that the Navy is going to be doing there, everything they do everywhere else in the world. And that's exactly the right notion to have. But the challenges in Alaska are very real, as she suggests. The notion of freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight are the same kind of issues that we employ defense interests in and defense resources to around the world. We're certainly wanting to hold on to those as core interests to be able to do the same thing in the Arctic as well. And even to the point of suggesting that preventing terrorist threats from yet a different corner of the world, whatever might be mounted from the Arctic with regard to our own interests here in the United States, in the coastal United States, or in the lower 48, are very real issues for us to have on the table as well. So if you're a strategic planner, which I think the essence of what it is that we want to always get to, and it's why the Atlantic Council should host these conversations and probe all of us to be continuing to think about such things, there's sort of string that goes along with the notion of strategic planning. There's data elements that if you refine them carefully enough, they become information. And if you take information and refine it carefully enough, it becomes knowledge. And if you take that knowledge, those knowledge elements, and refine it well enough, it becomes strategy. And strategy leads to the tactics that we should all be employing with regard to those things that are of interest to us, whether they're national interests at the Washington, D.C. U.S. level, or whether they are on service interests to any of the armed services that we discuss all the time. So if you go back to the data piece at the very beginning and think about just plain facts, I'll provide you just a handful of facts that will provoke you to be very interested in what it is that we're talking about with regard to the Arctic. The sea ice is melting at twice the normal rate. The polar ice cap is 25% smaller than it was in 1978. This notion of a third ocean border has the potential to invite rogue actors to take advantage of that third ocean, as they have tried to take advantage of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and of course, including the Caribbean. The simple fact that commercial investment is actually happening in the Arctic and needs to be recognized for the value that it represents eventually, so as to have that balance between government, public, and commercial private investment push the infrastructure investments necessary to take advantage of what we were talking about with the first panel, that is taking advantage of all that the region offers with regard to resources and other capability. This notion, as Ian introduced the panel with regard to the Northwest, the infamous Northwest Passage being sought for a couple of hundred years and now probably realized within the next 10, or even the Northeast Passage, is facts that are on the table that will dramatically reduce transit times for an awful lot of the commercial trade routes that we understand and ply the world's oceans today. There has probably been a 300% increase in human activity in the Arctic over the last 10 years. Think about that with some of the things we heard about from the panel this morning, thinking all the way back to a couple of hundred years ago. To have that kind of an increase in just the last decade is pretty extraordinary. And as also we heard this morning, this afternoon in the first panel, 13% of the world's undiscovered oil is in Alaska, is in the Arctic. 23% of the world's undiscovered gas is in the Arctic. $1 trillion potentially worth of seabed minerals are in the ocean floor of this area that we're talking about today. Those are the facts that provoke us to think more carefully about our game plan with regard to the Arctic. And sadly, as the U.S. ponders such things, others are acting. Whether it is the second thing that I'd like to talk to you about, which Amy introduced with her opening comments, that is the Law of the Sea Convention. I'll chat about that just for a second. But if you think about those others acting, Joe has mentioned and other panelists have mentioned already, Russian claims to the North Pole as an extension of the Lomonosov Ridge, as an extension of Russia into the Arctic. 6 new bases north of the Arctic Circle, 16 deepwater ports, 40-plus icebreakers, energy projects, 13 airfields. Some people are acting while we are pondering what might be the right things to do. And also, as was mentioned this morning, even China, who now perceives themselves as a quote-unquote near-Arctic country, whatever that means, a near-Arctic state, but they are building new icebreakers, and the PLA, as has been mentioned, just even recently when the president visited, was sailing the Aleutians in the Bering Sea. The second thing that I'd like to talk about for a moment is this UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. The facts associated with that, very straightforward. 167 countries have joined the convention, including Russia and China. And those who are not members of the convention include North Korea, Iran, Syria, Libya, and the United States of America, a neighborhood that perhaps we have not normally found ourselves delighted to be part of. But that's the facts of the moment. And to whatever degree the Senate has, over the course of since 1982, when the convention was put into practice, every chief of naval operations, every commandant of the Coast Guard, every secretary of defense, every secretary of state, every president has supported the notion of the United States joining and ratifying this particular convention. In the meantime, 30 years has gone by, 35 years has gone by, and to whatever degree all those member nations have been discussing things at the table, the United States has not even had a seat at that table to participate in those discussions. There are enormous EEZ implications to that reality, including in the Arctic, and if in fact we have no seat at the table, if in fact we have failed to ratify, I would offer that that is the first significant and major step on the diplomatic stage, on the international stage, that the U.S. has said we're not going to participate in this. And it's sort of phase one of what could be on the table, even in the near-term future, the predecessor to subsequent steps where we would either take a step backward even further or stay and choose to participate in what might be going on in the Arctic region. The third thing I'd talk about is sort of parallel to what the Undersecretary mentioned with regard to the Navy. And that is that the U.S. Coast Guard has enormous equities in the maritime side of what we're doing in the Arctic. We have 11 legislatively mandated missions that we perform for our country everywhere else. And with regard to this third ocean border, whether it is about search and rescue, whether it is maritime law enforcement, whether it is spill response to oil spills, whether it's marine safety, validation of adequate facilities, or licensing and certification of the mariners who supply those waters, whether it's aids to navigation, whether it's national security, all these are legislatively mandated missions that the U.S. Coast Guard performs for our country. And we will be making every effort to do those in the Arctic as well as we do them everywhere else in our service. So the notion of icebreaking being one of those 11 mandated missions is the one that's on the table almost immediately when you think about protecting our interests in the Arctic with regard to access. So my conclusion is, of the moment, we can firmly say that access and science remain legitimate issues of concern for our country, that national security issues now are very real and getting more serious as days and weeks and months go by, and that we seem to be falling further behind with regard to our reference points in that array of work, and that we hamstring ourselves with our own decisions. And to step back a step further would, I think, put us in even more jeopardy than is the case today. Other nations are proven their abilities to be very aggressive. The resource exploitation is actually going to happen in the Arctic, whether it happens with the U.S. as a participant, wherein, as someone has mentioned in our panel earlier today, the technical expertise with regard to safety and response is very much a peak of what the U.S. has the capability to do and do well. I have often said that in the aftermath of 9/11, a leadership trait or a leadership competency that either nations project or individuals project is that of collaboration. And although it perhaps was less on the table in the days before 9/11, this new normal world that we're trying to understand and live in post 9/11 puts an emphasis on collaboration as a skill. National collaboration is a skill that I know Bob is working on very diligently in his work from state, and it's one that I think all of us need to address and be part of in this world of ours going forward.
Thank you, Jim. You've underscored the pace of change over there. You've given some graphic detail about the force balance shifts that are occurring over there, particularly on the Russian side, and really appreciate the point you made about UNCLOS, the UN Conventional Law of the Seas. From my perspective, it's long overdue to have it ratified. You've all talked about change. You've all touched on a changing security environment over there. And what I want to do, Janine, is turn to you first and have you look out 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And in light of leveraging your background that you're as a senior naval official, your background as a person who's worked on force posture issues, how do you see these changes affecting the requirements on the Navy? You mentioned operating competencies, international partners, navigations, but maybe if you could give us a little bit of a sense. I mean, do we have the ships that we need to operate under this changing in this changing environment? I mean, this is a major. This isn't just not a lake that's being. This is a major sea that's opening up. There is a lot more military activity in there. There's 300% more human activity over there. How is that stressing your force? Is it creating demand? Should Congress now be thinking about additional platforms configured for that operating environment, which you just described as being very unique?
Well, I mean, I think that, the short answer is that, like I said before, we're a global Navy, right? So we're going to have to balance where the biggest threats are and where we need to focus our energy. When I think about the role of the Navy, like I said, we're going to do in the Arctic what we do everywhere else. It's a little bit more challenging of an environment. And one of the capabilities that we bring there that we already have are our submarines. And that's sort of our qualitative edge up there already. The Coast Guard has the ice-breaking mission by law, and we're going to support them on that. The Congress is considering whether or not we should, how they're going to fund this, but we will help them build it. We build ships. We build lots of them, and we build them well, so we'll be helping with that. But in terms of, as the ice melts, then what kind of environment is it, right? And if it's happening as rapidly as we say, we're grappling with, do we need to fundamentally change the way we're structured for an environment that's actually getting warmer, right, over time? We have submarines already, we're in the air, and we're focusing on operating in that environment. So I think it's going to be a gradual changes, mostly focused on competencies, operations, training, cooperation, doctrine, definitely leveraging our submarine fleet and our aircraft.
Let me just push you a little bit because, for example, in submarines, we clearly have, I think, more submarines than the Russians. But our submarines are globally deployed.
They are.
They got to deal with our good friends in North Korea, China, who knows what's going on in Africa and such.
Yes.
The Russians, they have a smaller fleet, but a significant fleet, but one that operates pretty much in the Arctic and in the local waters around them.
Well, both, different actors around the world are also starting to operate more globally outside their backyard. But you're right, we, the United States and the United States Navy, operate globally. And that is one of our challenges, which is exactly why we're, and the changing threats environments that we've seen in a couple of years, definitely the changes in the way the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians, they've all been acting. We're doing a whole fleet architecture review to examine that question exactly. I mean, I can't predict how it's going to come out, but it's a big world, and we need lots of ships.
I'm glad you're on it. Joe, let me turn to you because you took the air and land perspective on the Arctic. You spoke very forcefully about some potentially bad decisions the last administrations have made about the posture in the Arctic. I'd like to ask you two questions. What would you like to go back? What would you like to see in the Arctic in terms of our posture there? And then leveraging your hat as a former SAC-UR, what role would you anticipate or should NATO be exploring to enhance and preserve the peace in the Arctic?
Two questions. Let me talk to the first one first. And I didn't mean to criticize the administration. It was budget pressures that drove a decision that probably was not the best decision. And to the credit of the administration, when brought up to them, Secretary Carter and the Army says, yeah, we kind of agree that was a bad decision. And they reversed it. But it's back to sequestration, which we all know in this town is a problem. And if we don't get sequestration solved, the Army is not going to stop at 450,000 troops. They're going to be at 420,000 troops. And the pressure is going to be even stronger to draw down. So that's a problem that's got to be fixed. I'm not trying to go back 20 years, but 20 years ago, when I was commander of Alaskan Command, we had a full Army division, the 6th Infantry Division in Alaska. We've got wonderful training opportunities, better training opportunities than anywhere in the United States for air and land. I mean, we've got the J-Park, the range complex in the center of Alaska. You could put the whole state of Nevada in there, and you can fly supersonic over land, which you can't do anywhere in the lower 48 to do it. So it is a great training opportunity for both land, air, and naval air, by the way, and the Navy and the Marines come up and participate in our exercise, as well as do nations from around the world. So there is an awful lot of opportunity in Alaska. The only restraint on it are the budget constraints that we somehow have got to get through. With regard to NATO, I look at out of the 8 Arctic nations, you've got 5 of them are members of NATO. 2 of them are very close partnership for peace, Finland and Sweden, with NATO. Russia technically is a partnership for peace nation, but hasn't been very constructive recently. So you've got, NATO has to look at that. And I'm sure they are. And one of the things that's bringing attention to it, quite frankly, back again, the Iskander nuclear missiles putting into Kaliningrad. All of a sudden, that's got NATO's attention. They have to focus on the Arctic.
I could see Russia and NATO actually collaborating. And this is the one area we actually, one of the few areas we have, between the West and Russia, where collaboration seems to be occurring. Respect for norms of behavior,
The Arctic Council.
Arctic Council, collaboration with the Norwegians is very good. So if one considers a more robust deterrent posture against Russia, the Arctic might be the hand of a partnership that we use for both.
One thing I will add, and to go along with that, in 1993, we had the first U.S.-Russia exercise since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It was called Arctic SAREX, and I was privileged to lead that exercise to go to Tixi, Russia. And we took helicopters and C-5s and troops, and it was a very, very successful exercise. And it survived even in the bad days when you and I were working together of the early 2000s, because the Russian Far East liked it, and they didn't care anymore what Moscow said than we did. In recent times, I think it has come under some constraints, and we're not doing it now. But the SAREX, where we had Russia, United States, and Canada all working in a collaborative environment, assuming an airplane goes down somewhere in the Arctic, how are we going to get there and rescue the people? It was a very, very good exercise, and it kept us talking. It was a confidence-building measure. And I had the opportunity to talk to the chief of the Russian military as we're going back and forth to do that. We need to be pushing on something like that again.
Yeah, if I may, and there's another forum, in fact, two. The Northern Pacific Coast Guard Forum is made up of the countries that have an interest in the maritime side of a handful of what I'd call more benign mission focus areas, whether it's search and rescue or law enforcement, fisheries enforcement, spill response, those kind of things. That forum over the years has become one of those opportunities where we talk with each other, the Russians and all. So that's made up now. Bob, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and I'm sure you will when it's your turn on the stage. But the natural folks that you might imagine in the North Pacific Forum, it is Russia, it is the United States, it is Canada, it is originally South Korea and Japan. Those countries have a common forum in which they talk about and actually deal with those mission area elements that are what I'll call on the lower end of the spectrum, but can easily become the basis on which you talk about other things as well. So wherever we are talking in a positive engagement with regard to these other folks, that's that collaboration thing I was mentioning just a moment ago. It is the skill of the 21st century if we are going to get anywhere.
Let me draw on you a little bit more based on the experience, and particularly your points about the important missions the Coast Guard has. You really outlined a robust agenda there. Now we have the Arctic. It's changing. There's more access. There's more people, as you pointed, 300% increase in the human activity and such. More people exploring, using the transit routes and such. Do you see this as necessitating a change in the roles and responsibilities as they're distributed between the Navy and the Coast Guard?
Well, I think the partnership is exactly where that has to be, and it's the same partnership that we evoke around the world wherever those requirements are. I mean, I went to Vietnam as a patrol boat skipper because the Navy needed a small-sized patrol boat to deal with Operation Market Time in 1967 and 1968, 66, 67, 68, and on through the end of the war. And it became one of those moments where the Chief of Naval Operations looked to my service, the Coast Guard, called the Commandant and said, hey, we need A, B, and C, and can you provide? And we were able to provide. So that partnership, if you will, between the maritime services, including the Marine Corps, by the way, is a storied part of our legacy, frankly, as a maritime nation that has allowed us to do really good things for a really long time. That's just going to be continued in the Arctic with the new set of challenges that we're all describing today. And I continue to go back to this notion of the value of thinking about it with regard to a strategic game plan that puts into context a variety of things that you might do and then allows you to, on a more informed basis, choose what you will do. So the strategy that then becomes the tactics to be employed is based on that chain I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, where data becomes information, becomes knowledge, becomes strategy, becomes tactics. That notion. And to take on conversations like this, which help us understand the data and the information pieces, and translate them into documents like the Coast Guard's issued Arctic strategy, and those of other cabinet level agencies as well.
But no need to encourage Janine to include a relook at the roles and responsibilities that are distributed between the Coast Guard and the Navy.
Well, I think there's a pretty good ongoing kind of constancy of review on such things all the time.
We have a shared maritime strategy with Coast
Absolutely.
Guard, Navy, and
and
Marine Corps. It's a lot more than it used to be.
When the Maritime Domain Awareness Strategy was put out, it was because the Navy and the Coast Guard and the Marine Corps sent people together to build that that awareness strategy for the country. So I think those working relationships are really as sound as they have ever been.
Coast Guard needs more ships, though, yeah.
Not a doubt in my mind.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to open it up. What I'm asking is for questions or short questions or short comments, and we'll cut you off.
Easy
Identify
questions.
yourself.
Yeah,
easy
easy
questions
questions.
would be preferred by the panelists.
Easy questions.
Identify yourself, your affiliation, and make your point of your question. Harlan.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Ian, you run a great panel. I assume you're the one who wrote the title. It's interesting that this panel and the previous panel's first names were General, Admiral, or Undersecretary of the Navy. Now, I know that the next speaker is going to talk about the Department of State, but I wonder, to expand the aperture, what roles do you see the Department of State, Department of Interior, Department of Commerce, Energy, in terms of making a stronger argument? Because quite frankly, we're over-militarizing it in terms of this panel. And so what do we do about the other aspects? Jim Loy's comment about strategy is absolutely accurate. It needs to use a hackneyed phrase, a comprehensive approach. So how do we provide a comprehensive approach for the Arctic?
Joe.
Yeah, let me give a response. And I absolutely agree with you that we need more attention in this town from a lot of different agencies on the Arctic. And Admiral Papp has heard me complain about this before. I think it's an absolute tragedy that Singapore, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore, has more people devoted to the Arctic than the United States of America State Department does. And I'm not criticizing Singapore. I think it's great. They're thinking ahead, shipping and all this kind of thing. But we have got to bring this up. Nobody in Washington, and I've dealt with this for most of my professional life, wants to think about the Arctic or Alaska. It's something you have to keep doing. I applaud the Atlantic Council for having this today, because it's one of those ways that you try to keep this issue in front. And this is not peculiar to any administration. I mean, everybody prefers to ignore it. It's up there in the upper left-hand corner somewhere, and we don't have to worry about it.
I would just say that the structure of policy development for our country is housed in the National Security Council and its associated principals level and deputies level and working groups that grapple with these things. And the opportunity in those working groups to have one that is focused on the Arctic, and then inviting, if you will, or requiring the participation of the cabinet level agencies that you described just a moment ago. The structure is already there organizationally for those kind of things to happen and to happen well. It all depends on as Joe was just sort of hinting at very strongly, it all depends on whether or not, as the agenda for the National Security Council in this case, or the Homeland Security Council as it used to exist, are they going to put the Arctic and allow it to rise to the top of one that gets a great amount of focus, and you actually have to make reports and get data on the table to actually act upon. So I think the organizational structure within how we grapple with such things, either in the executive branch in the National Security Council and the working groups there, or in the way we put together the committee structures in Capitol Hill, allows for those things to occur. It's the prioritization of getting them on the table and on the front burner that is, I think, the greater issue.
Janine?
I mean, I would just say that I'm not so sure we're militarizing the Arctic, unless what you mean is that mostly it's security people in government that are focused on the issue. I mean, I think you're right that maybe the National Security Council or Homeland Security isn't the epicenter for this, but it is State Department and is diplomacy and is, So
Absolutely.
I think we would
all
all
those guys
probably agree
chipping in.
with that.
I'm going to use moderator's prerogative, just push back a little bit on Harlan. He makes a good point. The Arctic can't be addressed solely through a military lens.
Absolutely.
The concern that I have is that the last decade or so, we've largely looked at the Arctic through everything but the military lens.
Right.
And there
I get those
are
criticisms.
dynamics in play that we can get ahead of now that would resolve
It could be
the transformation of
right.
the region into a geopolitically contested domain. This gentleman right here, Lauren, I'll get you next.
Joel Coulter, DVA Consortium. Thank you, Joe, for bringing up the word collaboration. I met Admiral Papp a couple of years ago, and he said, we will collaborate with Russia. I said, yes, sir, that's true. I saw 140 U.S. businesses in St. Petersburg a few months ago when Russia was talking about its smart community. They have a thing out in San Francisco November 9th where they could bring all these people. So the UK and Canada put these major UAS centers of excellence where all these countries come in to innovate. In fact, the whale's largest in the world. So I know I'm going to be up in Alaska a few weeks talking about unmanned systems because that's one of my backgrounds. And I look at Keflavik, and what a potential Keflavik could be because everybody wants to innovate. It's a way to bring everybody together in HADR, search and rescue, environmental monitoring. Is there any consideration to seeing Keflavik as a center for the whole Arctic Council countries?
I'm not on the Arctic Council.
That's a good one for Admiral Papp.
Hold that question.
We'll save that for the next panel. I got Don.
Thank you, Don Lauren. I had to make that two-fingered intervention on Ian's question or his pushback, and I posed as a question. My comments were predominantly from a U.S. national security perspective earlier today, and we've talked about militarization and that. And my question is, what are we doing, if not internationally, or then unilaterally, to keep the Arctic safe? Because I look at this great graphic from General Ralston, and if it said UA Heavy 229 on it, this is wonderful. But I'd push that little point of origination a little toward the accessible areas of the Arctic now. And now I'm thinking submarine-launched ballistic missile intercept curves, and I'm starting to get worried here. So the question is, what's the United States' role in taking a lead in working with other Arctic and, quite honestly, non-Arctic nations to make this a safe and non-threatening region?
If I could add to that question, we talked a little bit about NATO before, but are there other institutions that ought to be addressing some of these security issues? Like, for example, the Arctic Council, which really hasn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, again, about the Arctic Council and the degree to which they address security issues, but I would contend that that would be a first place for a multilateral conversation on things like this. But, you know, back at the ranch, it's NORAD, right? So NORTHCOM, NORAD, Canada, their mission is to keep an eye on that kind of a threat, exactly. And with respect to when I said that we've said EUCOM and NORTHCOM, you all have the lead on making sure you analyze and determine whether or not we need to invest in other things. That's what NORAD is teed up to do. And I mean, I think, you know, the world is not necessarily a safe place. That's why we have militaries. So we're definitely gonna have to keep an eye on it. But I think the first, who was it that said you need two things, capability and intent?
Right.
We have to focus on intent. People have capability. This is a dangerous world. We've got to continue to focus on the diplomatic pieces and also, you know, make sure that we're ready.
One point I'd add to that. This group is a different subset of the American public. You understand the Arctic. You've thought about this. I ask you this. What percentage of the American public knows that our ground-based missile defense interceptors are located in Fort Greely, Alaska? You know, we've got a $150 billion investment of interceptors in the ground at Fort Greely in order to intercept nuclear missiles from North Korea or from Iran, both. That's just something that's not on the American public's mind.
They sleep safe at night.
Yes.
We've come to the near end of our panel here, and what I'd like to do is give my colleagues a chance, any final remarks they want to make, and I'm going to throw a question that might be useful as we try to get people to focus time, attention, strategy, and resources on the Arctic. For example, if you were in Janine's shoes, and Janine, you're in your shoes, what is the contingency that keeps you up at night about the Arctic? Is it a geopolitical collision? Is it a cross-border environmental disaster? Is it another incident that rolls out of control, as was described in the last panel, about one nation not wanting a rescue to occur in their territorial waters? What would it be? I'll start with Jim.
Well, I think the answer is yes. Any of those things, would provoke the serious concern, and there would be lots of meetings in the sit room in the White House. So that's why my notion is to go back to this fact and data-based research attendant to inventorying those challenges as we understand them, and making absolutely certain that we have run the gamut with regard to strategic thinking on it and produced, as necessary, the tactical plan on the shelf to deal. If we are waiting until it occurs, which is the essence of the question, it's way too late for us to think through a thoughtful response to the challenge that's on the table. So part of the value of strategic planning is that you sort of prophesy as to what those incidents might be, and think through the means by which you will respond to them when they occur. And so my hoped for answer to your question is that we are pretty methodically doing that at state and DOD and inside the West Wing, with a view to understanding what we may be asked to take on as a nation, and therefore be infinitely better prepared to actually do it if it occurs.
Joe?
What keeps me awake is a more subtle problem. If it weren't for the economic opportunities in the Arctic, we wouldn't be having this meeting here today. Mm-hmm. And if we somehow cut off those economic opportunities, people will slowly forget about the Arctic, and you'll never have anybody think about it again. And all these bad things can happen. So I think it's going to be the tendency for us as a nation to be isolationist and ignore those things we don't understand about. And as the economy comes down and the opportunities come down, then we'll forget about it.
Janine, you have the last word.
Well, from a security perspective, I worry about, bad international behavior. I want people to cooperate. I want freedom of navigation. I want that everywhere in the world. And I don't want to see the competition over resources and things in this region to start to get to a point where people are trying to block off other people's access. That's when the Navy will have to start to think, we have to think about that. So that worries me. But the other flip side that also worries me is people overreacting.
Hear, hear.
So there's your conundrum.
Janine, Joe, Jim, thank you very much. You've underscored why we have to introduce more of a security dimension to our approaches to the Arctic. It's not the sole dimension, but it's certainly an important one. And Janine, you make a good point. It's a matter of balance and prudence, but we also have to be deliberate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Great to see you.
I'm going to ask to come up and introduce our next speaker. Hey, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. My name is Berit Enge. I am the Washington correspondent for High North News, which is a web newspaper covering the Arctic with a headquarters in northern Norway, Bodø. We publish in 2 world languages, English and Norwegian. And in addition, we cooperate with a number of other publications on the newly established website Arctic Now. So I invite all of you to visit. There's no paywall, and please visit us. It is a pleasure to be able to be here to introduce the U.S. Special Representative to the Arctic, Admiral Papp, a person I think most of you know quite well. He has had a long and distinguished career in the Coast Guard, starting with his first tour, which I believe was to the Arctic, and ending as the Commandant of the Coast Guard until 2014. Listing all of his achievements would, of course, take too much time, more than we have here. But for all of you who think that you have a sterling resume, let me just tell you that when you look at the Admiral's Wikipedia bio resume, there is an entire page filled with awards and decorations. I thought that was quite amazing. He retired from the Coast Guard at the end of May 2014 for all of 6 weeks, I think, or thereabouts, and then was appointed by President Obama to serve as the President's special representative for the Arctic. Since then, he has traveled the world extensively. He has built strong international partnerships, and he has spearheaded the Obama administration's efforts to focus the world's attention of the developments in the High North. One of the advantages when you are asked to introduce somebody like this is that you have an excuse to ask other people about that person. So I took that opportunity, and here are some of the things that I found. He has 2 granddaughters who, appropriately enough, love the Disney movie Frozen. I hope that you have told them that a happy ending does not mean the melting of the ice, necessarily. He went to the Coast Guard Academy and the Naval War College, and then he evened it out by attending a former women's university, where the student body still is about 70% female, I believe. And as a commandant, he made the first ever appointment of a woman to head the US Coast Guard Academy, and also the first such appointment of any US service academy. I also spoke with some of his colleagues who see him at international conferences, some of them my former colleagues from Norway. They indicated a slight frustration when I mentioned his name, and said that usually these conferences start quite early. And when they stumble out of bed to look for their first cup of coffee, the person they meet is usually the Admiral, who has not only had breakfast, but has also been out for a 2-hour run. He has also made many trips within this city, some of them to Capitol Hill. And last year, I believe he proved his suitability for this appointment extremely well when there was a hearing in Congress scheduled on what became a very heavy snow day. I'm sure you'll remember we had quite a bit of those. Nothing was open, offices was closed, the committee was there, but nobody expected the Admiral to come, but he was there. Earned the respect of his colleagues on the Hill. As has been mentioned earlier here today, he has recently made a speech where he made some references to Star Trek. I believe that was in Reykjavik. And this was, I have to say, reported in High North News. This is about using such principles, similar principles, and finding solutions for the future. Today he's here to speak on what Arctic energy security means for American citizens. I don't know if he will have any Star Trek references for us, but we will be very eager to hear what he has to say either way. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Robert J. Papp.
Thank you, Barrett. And thank you for bringing up all those things as well. I don't talk about Frozen anymore. I got in trouble with the Walt Disney Company over that one. And Star Trek, I might talk about. That has been brought up twice. But what I would just say on Star Trek is I was trying to get something that would grab a large and diverse crowd, which we had in Reykjavik for the Arctic Circle Assembly. About well over 2,000 people in the audience, and particularly important, young people who we want to get interested and involved in Arctic activities. And what I did was I went back, I was quoting from a story that happened in a Canadian visit that I had. I was asked about, are there enough icebreakers, or is the United States going to build more icebreakers? And after reflecting for a little bit and talking about what we were actually doing, I suggested that there were probably enough icebreakers in the world already. It's just that they aren't very well distributed. And that perhaps if we looked at Star Trek as an example, where they have a united Starfleet with an international crew working together, giving you diversity and cooperation and inclusiveness and other things, that was the point I was trying to make. So it wasn't frivolous or anything, but I wanted to use that story. And as I said, I'm not going back to Frozen ever again. But this is the spot where the staff starts to get a little worried. I'm taking the nicely prepared speech that's been vetted and approved and everything else. I'm going to set that aside because first and foremost, I noticed that the crowd is significantly thinner than it was when I first got here about now almost 5 hours ago, I guess. And you've heard a lot of policy issues and details and things from other people who have been up here already. So I thought perhaps what I might do is just talk a little bit about what's on my mind, because I really want to get to your questions, which I think is the most important part. Because I could talk for hours about the Arctic and the things that I've learned, but I might not very well address your concerns. So I'll just give you a little context here and then try to get into your Q&As. First of all, Admiral Loren mentioned that he always likes hearing maritime history from me, so I don't want to let him down. And Meade Treadwell started out with throwing a little history out there about some Navy ships that happened to be in Sitka when the territory was transferred from Russia to the United States. What I would say is the revenue cutter Lincoln was in Sitka when the territory was transferred, the Revenue Cutter Service being the predecessor of the United States Coast Guard. I'm not sure why the Navy ships were there, because they clearly didn't have a purpose. The cutter Lincoln was there because, and I'm going to tie this in now because I'm a retired Coast Guard commandant, and I shouldn't be up here just talking about the Coast Guard. I am a diplomat now at the State Department. Well, the reason the cutter was there was because it transported the State Department delegation that went to Sitka, Alaska, to take possession of the Russian territory. And for 150 years, the United States Coast Guard has been there. In fact, most of that history, which is intertwined with the history of the state of Alaska, the Coast Guard has been the major federal contributor in that state and continues to be today, because the Coast Guard, as has been mentioned here, focuses on that broader definition of national security. We have the best Navy in the world. We have the best Army, Air Force, and Marines, but they are trained and maintained and resourced for a very specific mission, national defense, which is part of our broader national strategy. You have all these other things, whether it's economic, energy, food security, you name it, which is a part of that broader strategy. And the Coast Guard puts its imprint on most of it, and all of it comes to play in the Arctic. So I told you I'd give you a little context here. I thought that I'd try and tell you why I think this is important. Some observations that I've made in my 4 years as commandant, where we were focused on the Arctic. My predecessors had been focused on the Arctic, but it was becoming real for me in that job because Shell was drilling up there. Talk about access and energy security. We had Nome that failed to get its last oil delivery of the season before Norton Sound froze in 2011. We had to turn around the icebreaker Healy, which had been deployed for 6 months already, and keep them up there until we could find an ice-strengthened tanker which could carry the fuel oil through 300 miles of track through Norton Sound to get up there and relieve Nome, Alaska, so they would have fuel to get them through the winter. That's assured access. It was the only icebreaker we had available for the United States. We've got to do better than that, and I think we're making strides there. But why is it so important? Well, you know, I've gotten into a Nordic feeling over the last couple of years, having dealt with the Nordic countries on the Arctic Council. So my wife and I bought a cabin up in the mountains, and we wanted to decorate it. And I thought, since we're near a ski slope, a Nordic theme would be great. We found an old pair of antique wooden skis in the attic, and we put that on a display, but it wasn't quite enough. So she went out on the search, and she called me up, and she said, I found a nice-looking reproduction, antique, Nordic wooden sleigh. And I said, well, that's great. And I got home, and sure enough, it's beautiful. It's exactly the right thing for decorating our cabin. And I took the tag off. The tag says Nordic Lodge on it. And it says, cozy up to this gorgeous collection inspired by the Nordic countries. You'll find plenty of interesting pieces that are sure to delight as you accent your home. Made in China by Silk Road Designs Incorporated. And I think, you know, I'm stating the obvious. We know that a lot of the things we get are manufactured in China, but we don't often think about how they get here. Well, it's just so happened, almost at the same time that I got that tag, I went into the Washington Post the next morning, and here's, in the World section, a great big article on the expanded Panama Canal. And as you look at the picture, I know you can't see it from there, but I'll describe it for you. You look on the bow of this container ship that's going through. It's the COSCO Shipping Company, the state shipping company of China. And all those green containers on there say China Shipping. Okay, so what's the Panama Canal got to do with the Arctic? Well, COSCO, working for the state, China, had been looking at how do we lower our shipping costs. They were delivering and they were building larger and larger container ships to go to places like Long Beach and Seattle to deliver containers that then had to be transported across the United States. Not only were those ports getting crowded, it was getting very expensive, and because they had an almost monopoly on the West Coast, they could charge higher and higher rates. So China, being foresighted, started looking ahead. They started investing in Panama. And I can remember at the time there being a lot of people worried, why is China investing in Panama? And then they started investing in building what are now called Neo-Panamax container ships to be accommodated by the new expanded Panama Canal. And they were ready to go. As soon as the canal opened up, they were ready to go and start shipping through the Panama Canal to the east coast of the United States because it ended up being cheaper. In fact, what I have learned is they have reduced the transshipment costs, normally if they were delivered on the West Coast, from $2,000 per container to $600 per container. When you look at the millions and millions of containers that are delivered to this country, that's a lot of money. And they looked ahead. They were thinking strategically. They invested in Panama. They invested in these new ships that they were building, and now are making use of this canal in order to add to their prosperity and to maintain their market share. Following that is a story about COSCO announcing that they're going to ship to Europe across the Arctic. And they've been experimenting with an ice-strengthened container ship and are now in the process of building larger container ships to take the route across the Arctic. Now, I've talked to a couple of other container ship companies. Ones that I know had already said that they were not going to utilize the Arctic because the unpredictability, the unreliability that they need for on-time delivery of containers. And when you really get into a deeper discussion, what you find out is that they are not investing in that right now because they've got to answer to shareholders on an annual basis. They've got to have a balance sheet each year. COSCO, China, doesn't have to answer to shareholders. Therefore, they can think strategically, they can act strategically, and think out, not the undersecretary said thinking 3, 4, 5 years into the future. The Asian countries think 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And it's not because China's communicated that to me. I have done a lot of studying about China to see what they're doing because I need to understand why they're in the Arctic, why they're doing what they are. But what I get that from is talking to Singapore. Singapore has been brought up. Singapore has one of the largest delegations at every Arctic conference I go to because they realize, they have come to the conclusion that they are going to be bypassed in the future as having a strategic location along the Malacca Straits, and the next Singapore could very well be Reykjavik, Iceland. Joel asked about Keflavik. Yeah, Keflavik could become a container port someday, but Singapore is there, and I have talked to them, and they are very open about what they're doing. They also show up in places like Tromsø, Norway, as well. And even the little Faroe Islands have been in to visit me because they see themselves in a strategic location that potentially could open them up for a transshipment point in the North Atlantic sometime in the future as well. So these countries are thinking ahead, and they are investing because they're being strategic in nature. We've mentioned strategy a number of times here. But rather than it being a security conflict issue that often gets portrayed in the press, I think it's a prosperity issue. China's interested in its long-term prosperity, being a major world power, being an economic power, and they're investing, yes, in Greenland, and in Iceland, in Canada, in Alaska, and other places, because that's what a great power does. And they may very well have their shipping fleets going over through Arctic routes in the future. So yes, they were probably trying to make a statement where the PLAN sent some ships up there while our president was in Alaska, but also they are doing what a potential world power does, and is starting to do those things, whether it's investment, sending their ships out. Everybody was suspicious about why Shui Long, their icebreaker, was in the Arctic for almost a decade. I really believe, and in talking to others, they were evaluating. They're looking at the weather patterns. They're doing the science in order to make wise decisions on their investments in the future, and they've decided to go for it, and I think that's why they're there. Russia, when you break through the rhetoric, they are investing as well because they see the Northern Sea route as being a moneymaker for them. Yes, we have a dispute with them. They think it's internal waters. We believe it's an international strait, and we have difficulty dealing with that because we are not signatories to the Law of the Sea Convention. But having said that, Canada believes the same thing as well, and the Northwest Passage they consider to be internal waters, and we'll have to negotiate with both of them sometime in the future. But yes, Russia probably has military and security issues at play, but for the most part, what they are doing is they are making their airfields capable, they're having sensors, they're putting in communications, all things that I believe we should be doing along our north coast of Alaska to be prepared for the increase in human activity. That's maritime governance. That's being prepared for that broader range of security issues that maritime nations have responsibility for. The good news is, as Amy Pope said at the beginning of this session, we're starting to get some traction. And that is really part of the reason why when Secretary Kerry called me on the night of my retirement and said, you've been talking a lot about the Arctic, how would you like to do something about the Arctic? I jumped at the opportunity, first of all, because the Arctic Council is important and the work we're doing there is extensive. And I'm hopeful that this leadership position that we've had with the Arctic Council will translate into some momentum to keep us going. But it's also allowed me to work with the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. And Mark Brzezinski and Amy Pope and John Holdren have done a great job over there and have started to raise the visibility on many of these Arctic infrastructure issues that we need to deal with. As I said, I want to get into your Q&A, so I'm just going to say one final thing. I get accused of sea stories all the time. I told you a mountain story already about the cabin. The one sea story I'll tell you is my first captain on my first ship in Alaska. There were a couple things he gave me to read when I started breaking in as a deck watch officer. One of them was an investigation of Halsey's Third Fleet operating off the Philippines in World War II. They were so focused on what was going on in terms of combat operations that they failed to take heed of the signs of the weather. They got caught in a typhoon. It was one of the most disastrous fleet events in the entire World War II. Hundreds of aircraft, 800 sailors, 3 ships lost, and a lot of damage to others. And at the end, Admiral Nimitz personally wrote the letter that accompanied the investigation. And what my commanding officer was doing is he wanted to instill in his deck watch officers foresightedness, keeping an eye on the weather, etc. And in it, the line that gets quoted all the time is, Nimitz writes, "The time for taking all measures for ship safety is while still able to do so. Nothing's more dangerous than for a seaman to be grudging and taking precautions lest they turn out to have been unnecessary. Safety at sea for 1,000 years has depended on exactly the opposite philosophy." And what I would say is, most of what I learned as a sailor is applicable to life as well. And the signs are certainly there, and I would make the case that we are behind in terms of taking precautions and being prepared in the Arctic, and we need to start moving out. Right now, we've got some good signs. Our president has been very interested, but we've got a change of administration coming up. That will be our challenge, is to keep the momentum going and make sure that these accomplishments that we've made so far will continue on into the next administration. With that, I'm really looking forward to your questions, and all of you, thank you for hanging around to the end here.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions to start us off, and then I think there's room for a couple of questions also from the audience. I wanted to start at the issue, the title here, what does Arctic energy security mean for American citizens? And also bring up what I hear from our Alaskan colleagues. The view from Alaska and the view from Washington sometimes seems a little bit different. In Alaska, obviously, there's great focus on continued oil and gas development and development, which has brought many good things to Alaska, and that they hope to continue as well. Whereas from Washington, and of course from much of the rest of the world, the focus has been on the environmental issues and climate change. We've had the Paris Agreement. There's been great attention to the environmental issues in the Arctic, not least due to the efforts of President Obama. Mm-hmm. How do you square those two needs?
Well, I think Admiral Lauren made one of the best statements I heard, or at least it plays into my philosophy and what I've been talking about over the last couple of years, both as Commandant and in the current job, is we need to have the infrastructure. Whether you're talking about energy security or any other form of security in the Arctic, you need to have the infrastructure in place. Right now, we don't have a forward operating base, a deep water port up there. There's no fiber optic cable for communications up in the area right now. Airfields could use expansion and increased capabilities for servicing aircraft. There's no the nearest Coast Guard air station is 800 miles away. So I know the Alaskans were very disappointed, and Meade Treadwell mentioned when Shell made the announcement that they were leaving. I was actually up there for the Arctic Energy Summit being held in Fairbanks, and at midnight before the summit, the announcement was made, and the moderator on the first session actually called for a moment of silence. I mean, that's how much the impact was. We looked at Shell, and in fact, the Coast Guard used Shell as an example of why we needed to move ahead in terms of having proper infrastructure in Alaska to be ready to respond. I would say, for me, those concerns have not gone away. Once again, as Meade said earlier, any oil spill is bad, whether it's from drilling or whether it's a ship collision. And we still have a significant increase in traffic going through the Bering Strait. Other countries on the other side of the Arctic, where potential sea routes are coming, are making preparations and vying for strategic locations. What I know is that every possible sea route that you have comes back to one location, and that's the Bering Strait between Russia and the United States. And what are we doing to be prepared for that? And I think we've got a long ways to go, whether it's, as I said, a deep water port, forward operating base, and assured access, having icebreakers that can get in at any time of the year.
We've just had a look at a map of the Arctic in relation to the rest of the world. In the United States, I believe something like 99.8% of the population does not live in the Arctic, in Alaska. How do you get the rest of the U.S. to care about the Arctic?
That's been the big challenge. When I started out, once again, both as Commandant when we were working the Arctic strategy and in this job, I kept asking the question, what is the national imperative? When you look at investment in Alaska, the distant early warning system in the late 50s, which was a huge task taken on by the United States and Canada, the Alaska pipeline, the Alaska-Canada highway, and other issues were always driven by security concerns, whether it was the Cold War, the oil embargo, which really got it going in terms of doing the pipeline. I was hard-pressed to come up with something that would have as much significance to try and gain initiative and grab the attention of the American people. I thought Shell drilling in the Arctic might persuade people because we had just come off Deepwater Horizon, and the potential for oil spills was fresh in everybody's mind. And would we be prepared for an accident in the Arctic? But that we have short attention spans, and that moved by rather quickly. And then when Shell pulled out, that dropped that level of focus as well. But I started realizing just before the Glacier Conference, and then with the president coming up to Alaska, really what I view now as the national imperative is climate change. I think it was General Ralston who mentioned that we wouldn't be talking about this if it wasn't for the resources, the economic activity, and everything. But the reason we're talking about the potential for economic activity is because of the climate change and what it's brought to us. I have to admit that when I took on this job, I was really motivated by a lot of parochial reasons. I had looked at maritime safety and security issues. We looked at economic and living conditions issues that we put into our chairmanship program. And then, okay, I listened to the climate change people in the State Department, and we added a block of climate change issues in our chairmanship program as well. But as I've had the chance to travel around and talk to an awful lot of scientists, I've visited ice centers in a lot of countries, I've become passionate about this, and I think the president, in fact, handed us what the national imperative is, that, okay, it's a broad range of things. Climate change and the ice receding is opening up new economic opportunities that we need to be prepared for. But we also, we're getting these new sea routes that people have been looking for 500 years. But now we're getting it for all the wrong reasons. Those things that prevented them from getting those sea routes is going away, and with the commensurate impact on the climate across the globe. And the things that I've learned over the last couple of years have scared me. Yet I still retain optimism that we can do something about it as well. And I think the agreements in Paris, and other things that we will take on in the future will help to mitigate things. But we need to, I would say it's like everything else we've done. We're behind the power curve right now. We've got to move out smartly on this.
And of all the things you and the Obama administration has done, and you've obviously been very active over the last few years, which accomplishments do you consider most important to ensure that the work of this administration cannot be reversed?
I am very hopeful that the executive order that created the Arctic Executive Steering Committee will be sustained. Because I think what we lacked, and what I saw as Commandant of the Coast Guard, was a lack of consensus and people working together. When the Arctic strategy, when the national strategy for the Arctic that was signed by the president was issued, there was a implementation plan that was developed in accordance with it. And that implementation plan, my recollection is right, it was about 22 different agencies across the government that had some touch on the Arctic or had some projects of interest for the Arctic. And where do you set priorities? When you've got 22 different agencies across various cabinet departments, it's hard to get voluntary compliance across all them, particularly in a time when the budget's not growing. And anything that you do in the Arctic by nature is a new start. And there aren't very many new starts going on in the federal budget unless it displaces something else. So the executive order which created the Arctic Executive Steering Committee brought everybody together, and then we started the process of setting priorities. What you saw when the president went to Alaska was a result of that. We came up with a list of things that would have the most impact, icebreakers amongst them, but also coastal restoration money, money for clean energy. We need more, but it's a good start, and I hope that we keep this body together so that we can continue the good work that has been started.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of short questions.
I think that gentleman over there raised his hand right away when we came over here. So.
Hi, my name is Michael, and I'm a student at Johns Hopkins University, a graduate student. And we've been studying a lot about conflict management and conflict resolution. And with the high degree of cooperation that the Arctic nations have exhibited in conflicts and issues that have arisen in the Arctic region, With more issues and tensions rising in the Arctic, do you feel that the Arctic Council is the proper forum to address those issues, or do you think that as the United States transitions away from its chairmanship, there are going to be other avenues or forums or, I guess, meetings that would help reduce tensions?
Well, I think the Arctic Council is a good start because it does have the 8 Arctic countries in there. We have the observer states, those people that are interested in the Arctic as well. China being probably the most notable of the countries, but Singapore is in there and others. And importantly beyond that are what we call the permanent participants, the groups that represent the indigenous peoples of the North, who never get enough of a voice. I would have to say that, and I'm not, this is not just me, Admiral Barrett, who was up here, who lives in Alaska and is very sensitive to these things, remarked as we looked across the panels today, there's an awful lot of people that look like us up here, older white guys that have been on the panels. It would have been nice to get the vantage point of some of the Alaska natives as well. In fact, that was the first place I went when I took the new job, as I went up and did listening sessions with all the constituencies up in Alaska. But the Arctic Council is limited in what it can do because everything that's done within the council is done by consensus. The Ottawa Declaration, which created it, specifically said that it would be focused on environmental protection and sustainable development. Defense issues are specifically prohibited from being discussed in there. Someone asked that question earlier, which is understandable when you have 5 NATO countries, 2 that are closely aligned with NATO, and 1 who NATO is sort of organized to contain. So it would be very difficult to do defense issues. But having said that, everything's done by consensus, and it causes us to work very hard. It was one of the hardest jobs I've done, is to go to 7 other countries and sell our program. But what I would say is Russia, when I went there, gave me the most detailed, concrete, critical evaluation of our program with areas that we could improve our program. They accepted everything we had in our chairmanship program and has been perhaps our best partner on the Arctic Council in order to move our chairmanship program along. And I thought that, here I am, they asked me to take this job. It's a group that has to get things done by consensus, and here I have one of our countries which we just slapped sanctions on just before I got the job. But we've been able to work through that. The other thing I would say is thank you for being here. I meant to mention this in my opening remarks, but I was getting a little bit long there. I think one of the most important things that we've done in our Arctic Council chairmanship, and it goes back to my training as a sailor and as a ship captain, is you always look to the next watch. You've got to take time out of your schedule to train the young people who are going to take your place in the future. So I appreciate you being here, but it also coincides with, this is Arctic Fulbright Week here in town. We have sponsored 17 Arctic Fulbright scholarships to work on Arctic issues, and I'm going to spend my entire morning tomorrow listening to their proposals from the students. And the other thing that we have, which is even another step further removed, is we have 22 Arctic youth ambassadors who we selected, mostly high school or young college students that have been traveling around from Alaska and telling their story, and we hope that they will be policy people in the future as well. And they are in town to spend time with us during the Fulbright session and hopefully prepare our leaders of the future.
We had one more question here. Can we do that last one?
Hi, I'm Gwetta Mazzetti. I run task forces on energy security at DoD. Last one I co-chaired was the CNO's executive panel on energy security, and before that I co-chaired the Defense Science Board Energy Security Task Force, so I think a lot about these kinds of things. So one fundamental, I have 2 questions, and the easy question is, fundamentally, when you consider climate change, and I'm a big on climate mitigation, is the oil, do we know whether the petroleum there is cleaner than Canadian tar sands, Middle Eastern oil, what's being extracted now, coal. Has anybody done that analysis and sort of the well-to-wheels analysis of whether it would be, if you diversify the supply off of the Middle East, because 77% of the crude that leaves the Straits of Hormuz goes to the Western Pacific, to our allies there, and nobody has any indigenous oil. So it seems to me that if we haven't done the analysis about is it cleaner, and that whole comprehensive analysis, and then how does it either weaken or strengthen the Middle East, the Russian supply of Europe, because it seems to me that Europe could get their own supply without having to get it through Russia. They don't have any indigenous crude. And what about those little Southeast Asian countries that Singapore has nothing? Although they may, as someone pointed out, become highly irrelevant in this equation because they don't have many resources of any kind and they're just sort of a transit. Anyway, has anybody done the geopolitical analysis on that as to in order to position the United States to try to figure out how it would serve and how we best leverage it to serve our other international objectives?
Yeah, that is a very complex and detailed question, which I don't have a good answer for you, and I certainly don't have any answers in terms of which source is cleaner or not. And I've sort of skirted the issue of our energy, our oil. I would say I personally agree with all our Alaskan friends who have been here. We have to maintain our options, and I think that somehow encouraging further development is important. Simply because we're going to be dependent upon petroleum and gas for a long time. We've made great strides in terms of China starting to convert from coal. In fact, one of the reasons, yes, they're building ice-strengthened container ships, but they're also building ice-strengthened LNG tankers as well, and working and investing in the Yamal project in Russia because they got to fuel their industry. And whether they get it from the Norwegians in the Barents Sea or get it from the Yamal project, they're focusing on their needs for the future, and they're converting to cleaner fuels, which is very important to the great strides that were made in Paris as well. So I don't know to the bulkier question there, but and there was one. Oh, and Singapore. I talk about Singapore a lot, and I didn't want to burden everybody with my entire Singapore story, but they are intent on not becoming irrelevant, and that is why they are in places like Reykjavik and in Tromsø, because, and I've spoken to him. The minister that I talk to regularly is very candid with me. And he said they understand fully, but they have expertise in port management. They can build container cranes. And what they're doing is thinking 20, 30, 40 years in advance. They'll go back if they can make business agreements with Iceland or Norway or other places. They'll go back, they'll retool their industries, they'll revise their curriculums in their schools, because they intend to remain prosperous. And whether they get bypassed or not is irrelevant to them, because they are going to make sure that they maintain some form of competitive advantage across the rest of the world.
It seems to me that, just speaking candidly, if the Senate does go Democratic, you're going to have a fight on your hands about whether extraction should be allowed, revisiting the Paris Agreement, all of that.
Yeah.
So it's an important question as to whether just how dirty that oil is.
Isn't it great to be in a democracy? It's going to be exciting. And to answer, Joel, I think, asked a question about Keflavik. The former president of Iceland, I think, would have the answer for you. He would like to see something returned to Keflavik. And Admiral Loy, we have actually, I'm sorry I didn't talk to you about this, but we've gone beyond the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. We now have an Arctic Coast Guard Forum that my successor signed up all 8 countries, and in fact we had a search and rescue exercise, which I think is one of the important accomplishments of our tenure, is getting the 8 countries working together. We had a search and rescue exercise up in Anchorage and Kotzebue and Nome this past summer, where 7 of the 8 countries together, but we had 10 representatives from the Russian border agency that were there as observers and taking part in the exercise, and it keeps us working together face to face to try and make sure that we're prepared for the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much to Admiral Papp. Thank you to all the other speakers. Thank you to the Arctic Energy Center. And of course, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for keeping these issues on the agenda. Thank you.